I held the letter in my shaking hands. It wasn't a birthday card. It was a legal notice. My son and his wife weren't just ignoring me. They were building a case to lock me away and seize control of my accounts. They thought I was a fragile old woman. They forgot that I was the one who built this empire. Hello everyone, I am Mary. In my 60 years on this earth, I have seen families torn apart by secrets and greed, but the story I am about to tell you changes everything I thought I knew about blood loyalty. It begins on a Tuesday night in downtown Chicago, a night where the rain was coming down so hard it blurred the city lights into streaks of neon and gray. Evelyn sat alone at table 4, a secluded booth near the back of Le Jardin, the kind of restaurant where the menus don't have prices, and the waiters wear tuxedos, better than most grooms do on their wedding day. She was wearing her favorite silk dress, a deep navy blue that her late husband Arthur used to say made her eyes look like the Atlantic Ocean. She smoothed the fabric over her lap for the 100th time, her fingers tracing the hem as she checked her watch. It was a delicate gold Cartier piece Arthur had given her for their 40th anniversary, just months before he passed. The hands on the watch read 7:45. Dinner was supposed to be at 7 sharp. The 3 empty chairs across from her seemed to loom in the candlelight, silent accusations of her loneliness. One chair for her son Richard, one for his wife Vanessa, and one for the twins or perhaps a nanny, depending on Vanessa's mood. The table was set for 4, with crystal glasses that caught the flickering candlelight, and pristine white napkins, folded like origami swans. The waiter, a young man named Giovanni, who had been serving Evelyn for a decade, approached the table with a hesitation that broke her heart. He held a pitcher of water, but his eyes were filled with a pity she couldn't stand. "Would you like to order an appetizer while you wait, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, above the soft jazz playing in the background. "Perhaps the truffle flatbread you enjoy so much." Evelyn looked up at him and forced a smile that felt like it might crack her face into pieces. "No thank you, Giovanni," she said, keeping her voice steady, though her throat felt tight as if she had swallowed glass. "They will be here any minute. You know Richard. He is a very busy man." That was the lie she told everyone. It was the lie she told her friends at the country club, the lie she told her sister on the phone, and the lie she whispered to herself in the empty silence of her penthouse apartment. Richard was busy, yes, but he was never this late. Not for her 68th birthday. Not for the one day a year she asked for their time. She turned her head to look out the window at the relentless rain. She remembered Richard's 5th birthday. How she had stayed up until 3 in the morning, blowing up balloons until her lungs burned, just to see him smile. She remembered paying for his first car, his college tuition, his wedding which cost more than her first house. She remembered writing the check for the down payment on his colonial mansion in Highland Park, without blinking, because that is what mothers do. They give. And now here she was, sitting in a restaurant that smelled of expensive perfume and roasted garlic, waiting for a text message that wasn't coming. She picked up her phone again. The screen was black. No notifications, no running late mom, no happy birthday mom, just the cold digital silence. She unlocked the phone and dialed Richard's number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. "Hi, this is Richard, leave a message." His voice sounded cheerful, professional, everything he wasn't being right now. She hung up without speaking. She dialed Vanessa, straight to voicemail. She called the house landline, the one she paid the bill for every month. Ring, 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 nothing. A cold, heavy dread began to settle in her stomach, replacing the hunger. Had there been an accident? Were they in a ditch somewhere on the I-94 calling for help? Panic began to rise in her throat like bile. She didn't care about the dinner anymore. She didn't care about the disrespect. She just needed to know they were breathing. She signaled Giovanni over. "I am so sorry, Giovanni," she said, reaching for her purse. Her hands shaking so badly she could barely undo the clasp. "I have to go. Something might have happened." She dropped $100 bill on the table, not waiting for the check, not caring about the change. She grabbed her trench coat and walked out of the restaurant, her heels clicking loudly on the marble floor. A rhythm of anxiety and fear. Outside the air was freezing damp and smelling of wet asphalt and exhaust fumes. She didn't wait for her driver. She stepped to the curb and hailed a yellow taxi, risking the rain ruining her blowout. "Take me to Highland Park," she told the driver, a man with tired eyes, who nodded in the rearview mirror. "420 Elm Street. And please hurry." The ride took 45 agonizing minutes. 45 minutes of Evelyn staring out the window, counting the streetlights, praying to a God she hadn't spoken to in years. "Please let them be okay," she whispered to the foggy glass. "I don't care if they forgot. Just let them be safe." But when the taxi finally turned onto Elm Street, the dread in her stomach turned into something else entirely. Something sharper. The house was blazing with light. It looked like a cruise ship, docked in the quiet suburban neighborhood. And there in the driveway, gleaming under the floodlights, were the cars, the silver Porsche she had leased for Richard 2 months ago, the white Range Rover Vanessa insisted was necessary for suburban safety. They were home. There were no ambulances, no tow trucks, just the peaceful domestic scene of a family safely tucked inside. Evelyn paid the driver and stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, the rain soaking instantly through her coat, chilling her to the bone. Confusion swirled in her mind, mixed with a sudden sharp humiliation. If they were home, why weren't they answering? Why were they letting her sit in a restaurant, alone on her birthday? When she walked up the long driveway, her expensive shoes sinking into the wet pavers. She avoided the motion sensor lights by habit, stepping into the shadows of the manicured hedges. She reached into her purse for her spare key, but then she stopped. The living room window was cracked open just an inch, probably to let out the smoke from the fireplace. Voices drifted out into the night air. Loud laughter, the clinking of glasses, and then she heard it. Her name. It was Vanessa speaking, and her voice was sharp and cold, slicing through the night air. Like a razor blade wrapped in silk, she sounded nothing like the sweet daughter-in-law, who chirped happily about organic kale salads and yoga retreats. "She isn't just forgetful, Richard. She is becoming a liability," Vanessa said. And I could hear the clink of a wine bottle hitting a glass. Evelyn froze, her hand hovering inches from the doorbell she had pressed thousands of times before. She pressed herself flat against the rough brick wall of the house, the wet ivy soaking into the sleeve of her expensive dress. She held her breath, terrified that even the sound of her own heartbeat might give her away. Inside the warm living room, Richard mumbled something low and indistinct. Vanessa interrupted him, her voice rising with impatience. "Stop defending her, Richard. Stop acting like this is normal aging. Last week she couldn't find her car keys for 2 days. She was hysterical. She called me crying, saying the cleaning lady must have stolen them, because she had checked everywhere. Do you know how paranoid that sounds? Do you know how crazy she looked?" Evelyn gasped softly in the darkness. She remembered that day vividly. She had torn her apartment apart, looking for those keys. She had emptied every drawer, checked every coat pocket, and even looked in the trash. She had felt a terrifying fog settle over her mind, wondering if this was the beginning of the end. She found them 2 days later, inside a bag of frozen peas in the deep freezer. She had stared at them for an hour, terrified of her own mind, convinced she was losing her grip on reality. But then she heard Richard's voice, clear as a bell through the open window. "We moved them, Vanessa. We put them in the freezer to prove a point. You can't really use that against her in court." It was just a prank. Evelyn felt the world tilt on its axis. The ground seemed to drop out from under her feet. They moved them. They had planted the keys in the freezer. It wasn't dementia. It wasn't Alzheimer's. It was a setup. She clutched her chest, trying to force air into her lungs, as the realization hit her like a physical blow. Her son and his wife were gaslighting her. They were intentionally driving her to the brink of insanity. Vanessa laughed. A cruel sound that made Evelyn's blood run cold. It worked, didn't it? Vanessa sneered. She was a wreck. That is exactly the kind of documented incident we need for the competency hearing. We need a pattern, Richard. We need a paper trail showing that she is unfit to manage the estate. Evelyn's legs gave out. She had to grab the wet windowsill to keep from falling into the muddy flower bed. Competency hearing. The words bounced around her skull, shattering everything she thought she knew about her family. They weren't just skipping her birthday because they were selfish. They were building a legal case to strip her of her rights. She listened harder, tears mixing with the rain on her face, hot and salty against the cold skin. Richard spoke again, sounding weak and whiny, the voice of a man who had sold his soul for comfort. I don't know, Van. Putting her in a home seems extreme. She is only 68. She is healthy. She plays tennis on Tuesdays. Vanessa slammed something down on a table, hard enough to make the glass rattle. She is spending our inheritance, Richard. That charity gala last month, she gave away $50,000 to a dog shelter. $50,000. That is money that should be going to the twins' private school tuition. That is money for our kitchen renovation. If we don't get power of attorney soon, she is going to give it all away. To save the whales or feed the poor, or whatever nonsense she is into lately. We need to declare her incompetent before she bankrupts us. Evelyn stood there in the dark, shivering uncontrollably. It wasn't the cold anymore. It was the betrayal. The memory of the last 6 months flooded back to her with clarity. The misplaced reading glasses. The important tax documents that went missing from her study, only to turn up in the kitchen trash can. The times Vanessa would look at her with fake concern and ask, Mom, did you take your pills today? You seem so confused. It was a play. A script written by her daughter-in-law and performed by her son. Inside the house, the conversation shifted to strategy. Look, Richard, Vanessa said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that Evelyn had to strain to hear. The lawyer said we need one more big incident, something public, something that shows she is a danger to herself or others. Maybe at the club or a restaurant. We just need to push her a little harder until she snaps where people can see it. Then we can get the emergency guardianship signed by a judge. Evelyn stepped back from the window slowly, her heels sinking into the mud. She looked at the warm golden glow of the living room window, where the people she loved most in the world were plotting her demise. She looked at her phone in her trembling hand. 0 missed calls, 0 texts. They didn't care if she was dead or alive, as long as the check cleared. A fire ignited in her belly. It started small like a match struck in a dark room, but it grew fast, burning away the sadness and the shock. She wiped the rain from her eyes with a determination she hadn't felt since she took over Arthur's company 20 years ago. She reached into her purse and pulled out her car keys, the one she hadn't lost after all. She didn't ring the doorbell. She didn't burst in screaming and crying, asking how they could do this to her. That is what a crazy woman would do. That is what they wanted. If she stormed in there now, she would just be the hysterical mother ruining their evening and proving their point. Instead, she turned around and walked back down the driveway to the street. She stood in the rain waiting for another taxi, her jaw set like granite. She was going to go home. She was going to dry her hair. And then she was going to teach them a lesson about what happens when you underestimate the woman who built the empire you are trying to steal. The next morning, Evelyn woke up with a headache that throbbed behind her eyes. But for the first time in months, it wasn't from the fog of confusion or the anxiety of forgetting things. It was the sharp clarifying pain of truth. She sat up in her king-sized bed, the Egyptian cotton sheets feeling cool against her skin, and looked around her bedroom. For the last 6 months, she had woken up in this room feeling afraid, wondering what she would misplace today, or what simple word she would forget during conversation. Today she looked at the room and saw it for what it was, her fortress. She got up and walked to the bathroom, washing her face with ice-cold water, scrubbing away the tear stains from the night before. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't see a victim. She saw the woman who had helped Arthur build a logistics empire from a single warehouse in the South Side. She walked to the kitchen and made coffee, strong and black just the way Arthur used to drink it. She didn't turn on the news. She didn't check her email. She walked straight to her mahogany desk in the study, the same desk where she had signed multimillion-dollar contracts, and sat down. She pulled out her contact book, the old-fashioned leather one she refused to digitize, and found the number for George Abernathy. George wasn't just a banker. He was the custodian of the Vance Family Trust, and he had been managing their money since Richard was in diapers. He answered on the first ring, his voice warm and professional. "Good morning, Evelyn. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Evelyn took a sip of the hot, bitter coffee and let the silence hang for a second. "George," she said, her voice steady as a surgeon's hand, "I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it immediately without asking any questions." George paused, sensing the shift in her tone. "Of course, Evelyn. What do you need?" "I want you to initiate a total security freeze on the main trust and all satellite accounts," Evelyn said. "I want every credit card, every line of credit, every automatic transfer, and every withdrawal blocked, effective immediately." There was a longer pause on the other end. George cleared his throat. "Evelyn, that is a very drastic step. That will affect everything: the mortgage payments, the utilities, Richard and Vanessa's monthly stipends. Are you sure you want to do this?" Evelyn looked out the window at the skyline of Chicago, the city she had conquered a lifetime ago. "I am sure, George. I have reason to believe there has been unauthorized access, suspicious activity. I need a full forensic audit of the accounts. Until then, I want the money locked down, tighter than Fort Knox." George sighed, the heavy sigh of a man who knew better than to argue with Evelyn Vance. "Very well. I will put the freeze in place now. It will take about 15 minutes to propagate through the system. Is there anything else?" "No, thank you, George. That will be all." She hung up the phone and placed it gently on the desk. Then she sat back in her leather chair and waited. It was a cruel thing she was doing. She knew that. She was cutting off the oxygen to her own family. But as she watched the second hand tick around the clock face on the wall, she reminded herself of the conversation in the rain. They weren't family, they were parasites. And the host was finally fighting back. The first sign of chaos came exactly 20 minutes later. Evelyn was in the sunroom, pretending to read a novel she had already finished 3 years ago, when her phone buzzed against the glass table. She looked at the screen. It was Vanessa. Evelyn let it ring. She watched the name flash on the screen, imagining where Vanessa was. Probably at that overpriced day spa on Michigan Avenue, having her pores steamed, while plotting how to put her mother-in-law in a nursing home. The ringing stopped. Then a text message popped up. "Mom, is there something wrong with the bank account? My card just got declined at the front desk. It is so embarrassing. There are people staring. Please call me ASAP." Evelyn smiled, a small cold smile that didn't reach her eyes, and turned the page of her book. She didn't reply. 10 minutes later the phone buzzed again. This time it was Richard. Then the house phone rang. Then her cell phone again. The notifications began to pile up like snow against a window pane. 7 calls, 12 texts, 3 voicemails, each one more frantic than the last. The panic was spreading through their lives like a virus. The invisible umbilical cord of money that had connected them to her for decades had been severed, and for the first time in their adult lives, they were feeling the suffocation of reality. She waited until the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows across the room. Before she finally decided to respond, she didn't text back. She didn't call. She sat at her computer and typed out a generic email, one she had drafted carefully in her head, to sound like an automated banking system alert. Forwarded by a confused old woman, it said simply, "Dear Richard and Vanessa, I just received this notice from the bank, due to suspicious activity detected on the main trust. All linked accounts have been temporarily suspended, pending a security review. We apologize for the inconvenience." She hit send and poured herself a glass of vintage Cabernet. She took a sip and closed her eyes, listening to the silence of her apartment. It was the calm before the storm, and she was ready for the thunder. They showed up at her door the next morning, at 9 o'clock sharp, just as Evelyn knew they would. She had prepared for this moment, like a method actress preparing for the role of a lifetime. She wasn't wearing her usual tailored Chanel suit or her diamond studs. Instead, she had dug deep into the back of her closet and found an old oversized beige cardigan she used to wear for gardening, and a pair of reading glasses she didn't actually need. She left her hair slightly unkempt, resisting the urge to smooth down the silver waves. And she purposely didn't put on any blush, leaving her complexion pale and tired. She wanted to look frazzled. She wanted to look exactly like the confused, vulnerable old woman they were claiming she was to their lawyers. When the doorbell rang, it wasn't a polite chime. It was a long, aggressive press that echoed through the penthouse hallway. Evelyn took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of patience she possessed, and opened the heavy oak door. Richard and Vanessa practically fell into the foyer, pushing past her with a rudeness that would have shocked her 2 days ago, but now just felt expected. Richard looked terrible. His face was pale and sweaty, his designer shirt wrinkled as if he had slept in it. Vanessa looked dangerous, her eyes manic and sharp, her hands clutching her Louis Vuitton bag like a weapon. "Mom, what the hell is going on?" Richard shouted, his voice cracking on the last word. "Our accounts are frozen, the cards aren't working, we can't buy groceries, we can't pay the nanny. The mortgage payment bounced this morning, and I got a nasty email from the bank." Evelyn blinked rapidly, clutching the edges of her cardigan tighter around herself, making her hands tremble visibly. "Oh, Richard, please don't yell," she said, her voice thin and wavering. "My head is spinning. I don't understand it either. I spoke to the bank yesterday and they said something terrible." She watched Vanessa step closer, her nostrils flaring like a predator scenting blood. "What did they say?" Vanessa snapped. "Did you authorize this? Did you lock us out?" Evelyn shook her head, eyes wide with feigned innocence. No, of course not, dear. Why would I do that? Mr. George called me. He said there has been suspicious activity, flagrant spending, irregular withdrawals. He used words I didn't quite understand. He said the algorithms flagged the accounts. They think someone is taking advantage of me. They think I am losing control of my assets, so they initiated a protective lockdown. She watched the color drain from Vanessa's face. It was delicious. The bank was using their own narrative against them. If they argued that Evelyn was competent, then the spending was her choice and she could cut them off legally. If they argued she was incompetent, then the bank was right to freeze the assets to protect her from predators. They were trapped in a logic loop of their own making. "So how do we fix it?" Vanessa demanded, ignoring the fact that Evelyn looked on the verge of tears. "We need access to that money today, Evelyn. Today." Evelyn walked slowly into the living room, her slippers shuffling against the marble floor, and sat down heavily on the sofa, making sure to look small and defeated. "Mr. George said the only way to lift the security hold is to prove financial stability," she said, looking at her hands. "He called it a probationary family audit, Richard slumped into the armchair opposite her, putting his head in his hands. A what? A family audit, Evelyn continued, her voice shaky but her words precise. He said that for 30 days all non-essential transfers are blocked. We have to live on a strict budget. And more importantly, he said we need to demonstrate strong family stability. No erratic behavior. No conflicts. Just a loving, supportive family unit. If we can do that for 30 days, the bank will unlock the trust. If not, they will hand control over to a third-party executor appointed by the state. That was the lie that sealed their fate. A third-party executor meant the money would be managed by a stranger, who would never approve their lavish lifestyle. Vanessa went white. 30 days, we can't last 30 days without the trust. We have the renovation. We have the club dues. We have the Aspen trip booked. Evelyn shrugged, looking helplessly at the ceiling. I am sorry, dear. It is out of my hands, it is bank policy. Unless you want the state executor to take over permanently? The silence in the room was heavy and thick with tension. Evelyn could see the gears turning in Vanessa's head. She was calculating. She was strategizing, figuring out how to survive the month without their golden goose. Finally, Vanessa forced a smile. It was a terrifying grimace that exposed too many teeth. Okay, we can do this. We will be the perfect family. For 30 days, we can manage. Richard looked up, nodding vigorously, desperate to believe it. Yes, Mom, we will show them. We will be here every day. We will take care of you. We will prove to the bank that we are stable. Evelyn smiled back. A sweet grandmotherly smile that hid the shark swimming beneath the surface. I would love that, she said softly. I have been so lonely lately. It will be so nice to have you around more. She watched them leave 10 minutes later, still panicked but thinking they had a plan. They thought they were playing her. They didn't realize that for the next 30 days, they were walking into a minefield she had laid just for them. The very next day the love bombing began, and honestly it was like watching a bad soap opera, where the actors hadn't bothered to memorize their lines. Vanessa, who usually treated Evelyn's apartment like a contaminated zone, requiring a hazmat suit, suddenly arrived at 10 in the morning, with a casserole dish wrapped in foil. She breezed into the kitchen wearing a crisp white apron over her designer dress, humming a happy tune that sounded about as natural as a car alarm. Mom, I thought we could cook together today, Vanessa announced, flashing a bright white smile that didn't reach her eyes. I know how much you love your kitchen, and I feel like I haven't been supportive enough of your domestic side. Evelyn sat in her favorite wingback armchair, clutching a cup of tea and watching the performance with a mixture of amusement and disgust. She watched as Vanessa placed the dish on the counter. The smell of garlic and oregano filled the room instantly. Evelyn recognized that smell. It was the smell of Luigi's Trattoria on 4th Street. Vanessa hadn't cooked anything. She had bought takeout and transferred it to a Pyrex dish to pass it off as a labor of love. Oh, that sounds wonderful, dear, Evelyn said, forcing her voice to sound frail and grateful. I have been feeling so useless in the kitchen lately. My hands just aren't what they used to be. She watched as Vanessa moved around the kitchen, opening cupboards and drawers, pretending to look for spices, but Evelyn noticed where her eyes were darting. She wasn't looking for basil or thyme. She was looking at the stack of mail on the counter. She was checking the drawer where Evelyn used to keep her checkbook. She was snooping. She was hunting for bank statements or letters from the lawyer. Anything she could use to prove that the confused old woman had left incriminating evidence lying around. Richard was no better. He showed up an hour later, sweating slightly despite the cool air conditioning, carrying a bouquet of white lilies that was so large it was almost aggressive. He dumped the flowers on the dining table and sat on the ottoman at Evelyn's feet, taking her hand in a grip that was moist and uncomfortable. Mom, I was thinking we should go over your paperwork together, Richard said, his voice oozing with a fake concern that made Evelyn's skin crawl. You know, just to make sure everything is organized for the bank audit. I don't want you to stress about the numbers. I can handle the heavy lifting. Evelyn squeezed his hand back, marveling at the sheer audacity of this man. He wasn't trying to help her organize, he was trying to see how much money was left. He was trying to find the cracks in the fortress. "Oh, you are such a good son, Richard," she sighed, patting his cheek. But Mr. George was very specific. He said no one is allowed to touch the files during the audit period. Strict rules, he said. Federal regulations. Richard's face fell for a split second, a flash of genuine anger crossing his features, before he plastered the smile back on. Right, of course, just trying to help. But the worst part, the part that actually made Evelyn's heart ache, was the grandchildren. The twins arrived after school looking like they were marching to a funeral. They had clearly been coached. 13-year-olds who usually spent family gatherings, staring at their phones with headphones on, were now sitting stiffly on the sofa asking her questions about her childhood. "Grandma, tell us about when you met Grandpa," they recited in unison, sounding like little robots programmed by their mother. Evelyn looked at them and felt a pang of genuine sadness. It wasn't their fault. They were pawns in a game they didn't understand, being used as emotional leverage by parents who had lost their moral compass. She told them the stories they asked for, but all she could think about was the conversation she had heard through the window. These people didn't want her history. They wanted her erasure. And for the next few hours she had to sit there and smile, while they tried to bury her with kindness that felt like dirt being shoveled onto a coffin. While they were busy performing their roles as the perfect dutiful children, I was busy preparing the final act of my own play. 2 weeks into their charade, I told them I was going to the library for my monthly book club meeting. It was the perfect cover because they thought reading was boring and would never offer to join me. Vanessa actually looked relieved to have a few hours off from pretending to like me. She practically shoved me out the door with a smile, saying, "Have fun, Mom, don't stay out too late." I didn't go to the library. I told my driver to take me to a nondescript gray office building on the industrial side of town, a place where the windows were tinted dark and the air smelled of stale coffee and serious business. I was there to meet a man named Marcus. Marcus was a forensic accountant with eyes like a hawk and a personality that made a stone look chatty. I had hired him the day after I froze the accounts because I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went. I sat across from him at a metal desk, expecting him to tell me about credit card debt, or maybe some unauthorized withdrawals for jewelry or vacations. I was prepared for greed. I was prepared for selfishness. I wasn't prepared for criminality. Marcus slid a thick manila file across the desk without saying a word. The sound of the paper sliding against the metal was the only noise in the room. I opened it and the first thing I saw was a loan application. It was for $2 million secured against my beach house in the Hamptons. My eyes scanned the document, trying to make sense of it. The date was October 14th. I stared at the date, feeling a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. October 14th. I remembered that day perfectly because I was in Mount Sinai Hospital getting my hip checked. I was under mild sedation for an MRI. I couldn't have signed anything. But there at the bottom of the page was a signature, Evelyn Vance. It looked exactly like my signature. The elegant loop on the E, the sharp aggressive slant of the V. It was a masterpiece of forgery. I looked up at Marcus, feeling the blood drain from my face, leaving me lightheaded. "They forged my signature," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the quiet room. Marcus nodded slowly, his face grim. "There is more, Mrs. Vance." He flipped the page. Another loan. $500,000 for a business venture that didn't exist. Another signature. And then came the bank statements. They hadn't just stolen the money to live a high life. They had lost it. The statement showed a trail of disaster. Bad investments in tech startups that went bust. Massive transfers to online gambling sites. Desperate attempts to cover losses with more losses. They were drowning in debt, and they had used my name as the life raft. The realization hit me harder than the betrayal in the garden. This wasn't just about declaring me incompetent to get my money later. They needed the guardianship now because the loans were coming due. If they didn't get control of the main trust to pay off these fraudulent loans, they were going to prison for bank fraud. They weren't trying to put me in a home because they were annoyed with me. They were trying to put me away to cover up a felony. They needed me silenced and discredited, so that when the bank came looking for its $2 million, they could blame it on the senile old woman, who signed things she didn't understand. I closed the file and felt a strange calm settle over me. It was the cold, dead calm of a soldier who finally sees the enemy clearly. They weren't my family anymore. They weren't my blood. They were criminals who had broken into my life and were trying to leave me for dead. I stood up and smoothed down my skirt, my hands steady for the first time in weeks. "Make copies, Marcus," I said, my voice sounding like steel. "Make 3 copies of everything. And send a courier to the district attorney's office. But tell him to wait. I have one last dinner to host." I returned home that afternoon and sat in the dark for a long time, staring at the phone on the side table. The file from Marcus was locked securely in my wall safe, behind the painting in the study. But the images of those forged signatures were burned into my retinas like a scar. I felt a strange sense of detachment that I hadn't expected. The grief was gone, the anger was gone, even the fear was gone. All that was left was a cold, hard purpose that felt like ice water running through my veins. I picked up the phone and dialed Richard. My hand didn't shake, my breath didn't hitch. I waited for him to answer, and when he did, I let my shoulders slump and my voice tremble, just enough to sound pathetic. "Hi, Mom, is everything okay?" he asked, and I could hear the tension in his voice. The fear that I was calling to yell about another declined credit card transaction. "Richard the First, am so tired," I whispered, letting the words drag out. "The audit, the budget. Trying to remember everything Mr. George wants. It is too much for me. I think you and Vanessa were right. I am not capable of managing this anymore. I am drowning, Richard." The silence on the other end was heavy with shock. It lasted for 5 seconds. Then came the rush of relief. It was palpable even through the phone line. "Oh, Mom," Richard breathed out, a long sigh that sounded like a balloon deflating. "You don't know how relieved I am to hear you say that. We have been so worried about you. We just want to help you. We just want you to be safe and secure." I closed my eyes and swallowed the nausea rising in my throat. "I know, dear," I said, forcing warmth into my tone. "I want to sign the papers, the guardianship, the power of attorney, all of it. I want you to take over so I can rest. Bring your lawyer over on Friday night for dinner. We will sign everything and be done with it." I could practically hear him high-fiving Vanessa in the background. I could imagine the look of triumph on their faces. The belief that their gaslighting campaign had finally broken the old woman. "Okay, Mom," Richard said, his voice shaking with excitement. "Yes, Friday is perfect. We will bring Mr. Henderson. He has all the paperwork ready. We can get it notarized right there at the table." Mr. Henderson, the corrupt lawyer they had been conspiring with. The man who had helped them draft the documents to steal my life. "Good," I said. "Make sure he brings everything. I don't want any loose ends." When I hung up the phone, I didn't cry. I didn't feel sad. I walked to the antique mirror in the hallway and looked at myself. The tired, confused old woman they thought they knew was gone. In her place was a CEO who was about to close the biggest deal of her life. I spent the next 2 days preparing for the performance. I ordered the food from a high-end caterer. Because I wasn't going to cook for people who were trying to rob me, I cleaned the house until it sparkled, polishing the silver until it gleamed like a weapon. And I made one very important phone call to a man named District Attorney Miller. He had been a close friend of Arthur's for 30 years, a man with a jaw like a bulldog and a hatred for fraud. When I told him what Marcus had found, he didn't ask questions. He didn't ask for details. He just asked what time dinner was served. Friday night arrived with a storm brewing off Lake Michigan, fitting weather for an execution. The wind howled against the panoramic windows of the penthouse, rattling the glass in its frames. But inside the dining room was warm, and smelled of roast beef and expensive red wine. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, waiting for the vultures to land. They arrived 10 minutes early, which was a first. Vanessa walked in first, wearing a bright crimson dress that looked more appropriate for a gala than a solemn family meeting. She couldn't hide her excitement. It radiated off her like heat. Her eyes were bright and greedy, darting around the room as if she was already redecorating it in her mind. Richard followed close behind, carrying a bottle of Dom Perignon, which I thought was a nice touch of arrogance. Celebrating before the ink is even dry, I thought, watching him loosen his tie. Behind them trailed Mr. Henderson. He was a small man with a comb-over that defied gravity, and a suit that cost more than my first car. He clutched his leather briefcase to his chest like a shield, his eyes shifting nervously. "Good evening, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice oily and smooth as he extended a hand I didn't shake. "I am so sorry we have to meet under these circumstances, but I assure you this is for the best. It is for your protection." I nodded weakly, gesturing for them to sit. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I just want this over with. I want to rest. I am so tired of fighting." They sat down and the energy in the room shifted instantly. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at the empty space on the table where the documents would go. We didn't even bother with the dinner I had catered. Vanessa pushed her plate aside untouched and nodded at the lawyer. "I think we should get the paperwork out of the way first, Mom," she said, breathless. "Then we can celebrate. We can toast to your retirement." Retirement. That is what they called stripping me of my human rights. Mr. Henderson opened his briefcase, the latches clicking loudly in the quiet room, and pulled out a stack of papers thick as a novel. He laid them out in front of me, handing me a heavy gold pen. "Just sign where the yellow tabs are, Mrs. Vance," he said, pointing a manicured finger at the bottom line. "This grants Richard and Vanessa full power of attorney over the trust, the real estate, and all personal assets. It also appoints them as your legal guardians regarding all medical decisions, should you become incapacitated." I stared at the papers. The words swam before my eyes: irrevocable, total control, incapacity. It was the death warrant for my freedom. I picked up the pen and felt the room hold its breath. Richard was leaning forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. Vanessa was practically vibrating, her lips parted in anticipation. I hovered the pen over the signature line, letting the tip touch the paper just enough to make a dot. Then I stopped. I pulled the pen back. "Oh," I said, my voice trembling with fake confusion. "I almost forgot. I promised my old friend he could be here to witness this. He said it is important to have a neutral party present for something this big." Richard frowned, checking his Rolex with an impatient sigh. "Mom, we don't need a witness. Mr. Henderson is a notary. It is all legal. We don't need anyone else." I shook my head, putting the pen down on the table with a definitive click. No, I insisted. "He is very specific about these things. He said he wouldn't miss it for the world. He should be here any second." As if on cue, the doorbell rang. It was a loud, authoritative sound that cut through the tension like a knife. Richard sighed an exasperated puff of air, throwing his hands up. "Fine, I will get it. But let's make this quick, Mom." He stood up and marched to the foyer, his footsteps heavy and annoyed. I heard the door open. I heard the wind rush in from the hallway, and then I heard Richard's voice drop about 3 octaves into a sound of pure confusion. "Mom, what is going on? Who are these people?" I stood up then, smoothing down my skirt. The frailty was gone. The confusion was gone. I looked at Vanessa, who was staring at the hallway with a dawning look of horror. I smiled. "Oh, didn't I tell you?" I asked casually. Picking up my wine glass, I invited the district attorney, and I believe he brought the police. District Attorney Miller walked into the dining room, flanked by 2 uniformed officers, and a detective in a cheap gray suit who looked like he had seen everything and was impressed by nothing. The silence that fell over the room was absolute and heavy like a physical weight, pressing down on everyone's chest. Richard stumbled back into the room looking like a ghost, his face drained of all color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He gripped the back of his chair so hard, his knuckles turned white. Vanessa dropped her wine glass. It hit the hardwood floor with a violent shatter, sending shards of crystal and expensive red Cabernet flying everywhere like blood splatter at a crime scene, but nobody moved to clean it up. The dark red liquid seeped into the Persian rug, a slow spreading stain that mirrored the ruin, spreading through their lives. Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, was the first to react, with the survival instinct of a cockroach. He snapped his briefcase shut with a loud click, and stood up so fast his chair tipped over backward. "I think there has been a terrible misunderstanding," he stammered, his oily confidence evaporating instantly into a puddle of sweat. "I am just here to notarize some standard family documents. I was not aware of any other context. I will be going now." He made a move toward the door, clutching his briefcase to his chest, but the detective stepped into his path, blocking the exit with his sheer bulk. "Sit down, counselor," the detective said, and his voice was low and dangerous. "You aren't going anywhere until we see what is in that briefcase." Evelyn watched it all from the head of the table. She felt a surge of power coursing through her veins, a feeling she hadn't felt in 5 years. She stood up slowly and picked up the stack of guardianship papers, the ones she had almost signed. She looked at them for a moment, then looked at Vanessa, who was staring at the police with wide, terrified eyes. She ripped the papers in half. The sound of the tearing paper was loud and crisp in the quiet room. She ripped them again and again until they were just confetti, which she let rain down onto the table. "You aren't going anywhere, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice steady and strong, filling the room. "And neither are you, Richard, or you, Vanessa." Vanessa found her voice then. It was high and shrill, a sound of pure panic. "Mom, what is this? Why are the police here? You are confused again. You don't know what you are doing. This is insane." Evelyn laughed. It was a genuine laugh, deep and rich. "Oh, I know exactly what I am doing, Vanessa. For the first time in months I am completely lucid. I am doing what I should have done 5 years ago. I am cutting out the cancer." She reached under her chair and pulled out the thick manila file Marcus had given her. She tossed it onto the table, right on top of the shattered glass and the torn papers. It slid across the polished wood and stopped directly in front of Richard. "Open it," she commanded. Richard looked at the police, then at the file, then at his mother. His hands shook so badly, he could barely lift the cover. When he saw the loan documents, the forged signatures, the forensic proof of their theft, he made a sound like a wounded animal. "You thought I was senile," Evelyn said, leaning forward, her eyes burning into his. "You thought I was a helpless old lady you could gaslight into an institution, so you could hide your crimes. You forgot one thing, Richard. I ran a logistics company for 40 years. I know what fraud looks like. And I know exactly how to catch a thief." The next 15 minutes were a blur of motion and noise that seemed to happen in slow motion. The officers moved in with practiced efficiency, pulling the men out of their chairs. Richard began to cry. It wasn't a dignified silence, it was the messy, desperate sobbing of a child who realizes for the first time that actions have irreversible consequences. He actually fell to his knees, grasping at the tablecloth, pulling the fine linen until the silver candlesticks toppled over. "Mom, please," he blubbered, snot running down his face mixing with his tears. "Stop them. Tell them it was a mistake. Think of the twins. Think of the family. You can't send your own son to jail." Evelyn stood up and walked around the table until she was standing directly over him. She looked down at the son she had raised, the boy she had driven to soccer practice and nursed through chickenpox. She didn't see that boy anymore. She saw a stranger consumed by greed. I am thinking of the family, Richard, she said, her voice quiet but cutting through his sobs like a knife. That is exactly why I am doing this. The twins will be taken care of. My sister in Vermont has already agreed to take temporary custody until they are 18. They will be raised with values. They will learn that money is something you earn with hard work, not something you steal from the people who love you. They will be safe from you. Vanessa screamed as the female officer cuffed her hands behind her back. She didn't cry. She fought, kicking and spitting like a trapped animal, her mask of sophistication completely gone. You old witch, she shrieked, her face twisted into a mask of pure hate. You will regret this. We will fight you in court. We will take everything you have. We will leave you with nothing. Evelyn shook her head slowly, feeling a strange sense of pity for the woman. There is nothing to take, Vanessa. That is the funny part. As the officers hauled them toward the heavy oak door, Evelyn delivered the final blow, the one she had been saving for this exact moment. By the way, she called out, making them pause in the foyer one last time, you don't have to worry about the trust anymore, or the inheritance, or the estate. Richard looked up, his eyes red and swollen. What do you mean? He whispered. I dissolved it this morning, Evelyn said, leaning against the doorframe. Every penny of the liquid assets, the stocks, the bonds, the offshore accounts, has been transferred to a blind, irrevocable charitable trust dedicated to victims of elder abuse. I left myself just enough to live comfortably until I die. The rest is gone. It is all gone. Richard looked at her with wide, dead eyes. The realization hit him harder than the handcuffs. The $40 million he had been waiting for, the fortune he had destroyed his family to get, was gone forever. Evelyn nodded. Gone just like your freedom. She watched the police cars pull away, their lights flashing red and blue against the stormy night sky, illuminating the rain that was washing away the filth of the last 5 years. The house was quiet again. The storm outside was still raging, but inside, for the first time in months, there was a profound silence. Evelyn walked back to the dining room table. She picked up her glass of wine, which had miraculously survived the chaos. She walked to the window and looked out at the city lights. She was alone. She had no husband. She had no son. But as she took a sip of the rich, dark wine, she realized she had something much more valuable. She had her dignity. She had her mind, and she had won.